In southeastern Turkey, there is a place that breaks the straight line of history. It is called Göbekli Tepe. It does not begin as a vague myth or a debated translation. It begins with 16 tons of solid limestone. These are massive stone pillars carved straight from the bedrock and dragged up a dusty, barren hill. They are arranged in perfect, deliberate circles towering over the landscape, and they stand as physical evidence against everything we thought we knew about the origins of our past. The official timeline tells us that monumental architecture requires settled societies. It requires farming, surplus food, and a rigid social hierarchy. But the stones of Göbekli Tepe were erected 11,600 years ago. Let that number settle in the mind. This is not just a very old ruin, it is an impossible antiquity. It was built 6,000 years before a single stone was placed at Stonehenge. It predates the Great Pyramid of Giza by 7 millennia. It was carved at the very end of the last ice age. This was a time when the world was supposed to be empty of true civilization. According to the standard model of history, the people alive at this time were simple hunter-gatherers. They were nomadic bands, supposedly focused only on daily survival. They had no metal tools, they had no wheels, they had no draft animals to pull heavy loads, and most importantly, they had not yet planted a single seed of grain. The textbooks insist that agriculture had to come first. Only after humans learned to farm could they afford the time to build temples. But Göbekli Tepe proves the exact opposite. To cut a 16-ton pillar from solid bedrock requires profound engineering knowledge. To move it uphill without wheels requires the organized labor of hundreds of people. To carve it with intricate high-relief sculptures requires specialized artisans. A scattered band of primitive foragers cannot accomplish this. The level of coordination required to feed and direct a workforce of this scale implies a complex, stratified society. The official narrative simply cannot explain the existence of this site. Under the sheer physical weight of these limestone pillars, the simple timeline of human progress bends and breaks. The assumption that primitive survival evolved neatly into complex civilization is no longer a fact. It is a story that has lost its foundation. The stones prove that advanced capabilities existed long before civilization supposedly began. Something organized these people. Something provided a blueprint for monumental architecture deep in the Stone Age. This is not merely an interesting archaeological anomaly. It is hard, physical evidence that our accepted history is incomplete. Göbekli Tepe suggests that human history has a deep missing layer. The sacred came before the city, and the monument came before the farm. We are looking at a forgotten world, attempting to build something permanent in the wake of a lost inheritance. For thousands of years, this impossible workshop sat quietly beneath the earth. The official story of human progress remained unchallenged, protected by layers of ancient dust. But the illusion of a clean timeline could not last forever. In the autumn of 1994, an archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt walked up a dusty hillside, and he noticed something strange emerging from the ground. In 1994, Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute stood on a barren rounded hill in southeastern Turkey. The local people called it Göbekli Tepe. It was a quiet, unassuming ridge of earth that offered no immediate promises, but the ground was scattered with thousands of sharp flint flakes. These were not natural stones, they were the discarded tools of a massive forgotten workforce. When the excavation began, the dirt did not yield the expected scraps of normal human habitation. Instead, the trench walls revealed something impossible. Massive limestone edges began to emerge from the dry earth. As the workers carefully brushed away thousands of years of compacted soil, the stone took shape. These were towering T-shaped pillars, carved with precise geometry. Out of the darkness of the trench, intricate reliefs of foxes, scorpions, and wild boars appeared. The animals were carved in high relief, leaping from the sides of the pillars, perfectly preserved by the very dirt that had swallowed them. The official story of this hill had been entirely wrong. 30 years earlier, in the 1960s, a survey team had walked across this exact same ridge. They looked at the broken limestone slabs protruding from the grass. They consulted their accepted historical timelines, and they dismissed the site completely. They classified it as an abandoned medieval cemetery. It was a safe, comfortable category that required no further investigation. It is easy to see what you are trained to expect. But Schmidt realized that the official narrative was far too small to hold the physical reality of the stone. This discovery at Göbekli Tepe acts as an orientation lock. It recalibrates the mind to a new, unsettling scale of time. This temple is not just an isolated anomaly. It is the first visible thread in a much larger global pattern of erasure. It proves that our accepted historical map is cleaner than the actual terrain. If the official timeline were true, this site could not exist. Yet there it stood, rising from the bedrock. This physical contradiction forces a deeply uncomfortable question. If a monumental complex of this scale could sit in plain sight, dismissed as a mere medieval graveyard by modern experts, our certainty is fragile. If a site this advanced was hidden right beneath the surface, how many other pre-timeline structures lie unrecognized across the continents? We must ask how many natural hills are actually buried architecture, holding the silence of forgotten epochs. The implications were immediate and absolute. One discovery collapsed centuries of academic assumptions. The textbooks did not just require a minor revision, they rewrote themselves overnight. The deeply held belief that civilization was a slow, linear march was shattered by the impossible weight of 16-ton pillars. But the sheer size and artistic mastery of the stones were only the beginning of the problem. The true impossibility was not what these forgotten people built, but the specific moment in time when they built it. To understand the scale of the disruption, the excavation team needed precise, undeniable measurements. They needed to extract organic charcoal trapped in the construction fill. And when the final radiocarbon dating results returned from the laboratory, they delivered a number that broke the boundaries of human history. The date was fixed at 9,600 BC. It was not a theory, and it was not a loose academic estimate. It was a hard physical measurement pulled directly from the Earth, and it broke the boundaries of human history. To understand the sheer weight of that number, we have to recalibrate our entire concept of deep time. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built roughly 4,500 years ago. The iconic Circle of Stonehenge was erected around 3000 BC. Those monuments represent the absolute limit of what we consider ancient. Yet, when the first rough stones of Stonehenge were being dragged into place across the English countryside, Göbekli Tepe was already unimaginably old. It had already been buried in silence for 6,000 years. To the builders of Stonehenge, this temple was twice as distant in the past as Stonehenge is to us today. This timeline is not based on stylistic guesswork or fragile interpretations of broken pottery. Researchers from the Heidelberg Academy of Sciences extracted physical charcoal samples directly from the original construction fill of Layer 3. They placed this organic material under rigorous radiocarbon analysis. By measuring the precise decay of carbon isotopes, they locked the megalithic construction phase into an absolute temporal grid. The results were undeniable. The massive 16-ton limestone pillars were carved, transported and erected exactly 11,600 years ago. That single unyielding number destroys the foundation of the standard historical timeline. For over a century, the official story of the Neolithic Revolution was clean, simple and strictly linear. Humanity supposedly learned to farm, which slowly created a food surplus. That surplus finally allowed for permanent settlements, which eventually, over thousands of years, led to social hierarchy, kings and monumental architecture. Moving 16-ton stones was supposed to be the final reward of a fully developed agricultural society. But the builders of Göbekli Tepe did not have agriculture. They had never planted a single seed. They were hunter-gatherers with no domesticated draft animals, no wheeled transport and absolutely no metal tools. The old progressive model had the story completely backward. It was not a comfortable agricultural surplus that gave humanity the free time to build temples. It was the overwhelming drive to build these sacred spaces that forced humanity to organize in massive numbers. Purpose and ritual drove the complexity, not farming. The sacred came first, and it demanded an impossible architecture. The precision of the Heidelberg radiocarbon dating leaves no room for the usual academic excuses. We can no longer write this off as a localized anomaly, or a misread layer of dirt. This complex predates every known civilization by millennia. It proves, beyond any reasonable doubt, that a highly organized, deeply capable society existed in the deep past, long before the official narrative says it was even possible. But this impossible date forces us to look closer at the timeline of the Earth itself. If human beings were already capable of such immense coordinated engineering 11,600 years ago, we are left staring at a much darker, heavier mystery. What catastrophic event occurred exactly 12,900 years ago, just before these temples were carved, that forced a highly advanced humanity to start over, surviving only on the fragments of what they once knew? The date written in the stone of Göbekli Tepe does not sit in a vacuum. It directly aligns with a scar cut across the entire planet. Geologists call this scar the Younger Dryas boundary layer. It marks a moment in deep time, exactly 12,900 years ago, when the world simply broke. We are taught to think of climate change as a very slow, lumbering beast. It is presented as a process of gradual shifting over tens of thousands of years. In the standard model of history, environments transition gently. The ice creeps forward, or the ice melts back, and human beings always have time to pack up their camps, adapt, and walk away. That is the comforting version of the story. It allows us to believe that the Earth is fundamentally stable and that human progress is guaranteed. But the physical evidence from the far north shatters that comfort. Deep within the Greenland ice sheet, scientists from the GIS-P2 project drilled down through miles of frozen history. They extracted continuous columns of ancient ice, pulling up physical records of the atmosphere that date back far beyond human memory. Right at the 12,900-year mark, they did not find a slow transition. They found a cliff. The stratigraphic boundary in the ice is violently sharp. It marks the onset of the Younger Dryas, a period of sudden, catastrophic freezing that gripped the northern hemisphere and disrupted the entire globe. This is the point where the investigation leaves the realm of ancient mythology. When we talk about a great flood or a brutal winter that swallowed the earth, we are no longer dealing with folklore. We are not looking at metaphors written on clay tablets or the exaggerated fears of primitive hunter-gatherers. The cataclysm is not a myth. It is a hard, undeniable geological fact. It is written in the physical chemistry of the planet. The oxygen isotope data from the Greenland ice cores is precise, and it is terrifying. It shows that global temperatures did not drift lazily downward. The Earth cooled with the speed of a falling stone. Average temperatures plunged by 10 degrees Celsius, and this did not happen over 1,000 years. The ice tells us it happened in under 50 years. Imagine what that means for a living ecosystem. Rivers freezing solid before a child reached adulthood, growing seasons vanishing in a single decade, the forests dying back, and the great herds starving in the sudden, unending winter. It is a level of environmental violence that our modern world cannot easily comprehend. The physical reality of this event changes everything we assume about human resilience. It proves that a civilization-ending reset is not just a theoretical possibility. An advanced, complex society would not have the time to adapt to a 10 degrees Celsius drop in a few decades. Their agriculture would fail. Their trade routes would collapse. The world they built could be completely erased within a single generation, leaving only a few traumatized survivors wandering through the ruins. The timeline was severed. The slate was wiped clean. And the proof of this sudden apocalypse is not hidden in a lost temple or debated in a university hall. It is trapped forever in the dark. It is waiting in the microscopic bubbles of ancient air, frozen deep in the ice, keeping the perfect record of a world that died overnight. The memory of this global cataclysm is not only written in buried stone, it is perfectly preserved, locked away in the ice. High above the Arctic Circle, researchers drill deep into the Greenland ice sheet, pulling up long, translucent cylinders of frozen time. Inside these cores, microscopic bubbles of ancient air remain trapped exactly as they were when they first fell as snow. By reading the layers of oxygen isotopes, scientists can reconstruct the ancient atmosphere, layer by layer, year by year, like the rings of a drowned tree. The record they found is not a story of gradual change. The data from the University of Copenhagen Niels Bohr Institute is entirely unambiguous, and it paints a terrifying picture. Their extensive analysis of these deep ice cores reveals a sharp, catastrophic boundary line. It is perfectly synchronized with the 12,900 BC horizon, the exact moment the timeline of human progress seems to violently fracture. Those microscopic bubbles show that global temperatures plunged 10 degrees Celsius. In the geological record, such a drastic shift usually takes tens of thousands of years, allowing lifetime to adapt. But this did not happen slowly. The ice shows that this massive drop occurred in the span of just a few decades. For the people living through it, it was an apocalypse of frost, condemning the world to a sudden, brutal winter that simply never ended. We have to imagine what a 10-degree drop actually means for the physical world. For any advanced civilization living at that exact moment, the shift was an immediate, inescapable death sentence. As the climate violently destabilized around the globe, predictable rainfall patterns shifted overnight. The life-giving monsoons failed. The growing seasons completely vanished, replaced by frost that killed the harvests before they could even sprout. Any complex coastal populations or early agricultural systems would have collapsed into mass starvation within a single generation. There was no time to adapt, no time to migrate, and no time to engineer a solution. The cold was sudden, and it was absolute. Entire human lifespans were swallowed completely by the freezing dark. A grandfather might have remembered a warm green world where rivers flowed and food was plentiful, but his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren would be born into a world of endless ice, knowing the warmth only as a fading myth told around a dying fire. If highly organized cultures existed before this boundary, the climate collapse would have systematically obliterated them. Their wooden structures would have rotted or burned for fuel. Their fields would have been buried under permafrost. The survivors of this endless winter were stripped of their earthly inheritance. They were forced into caves and temporary shelters, reduced to hunting and scavenging, left to rebuild human history from nothing but shattered fragments of memory. The ice keeps the record of the atmosphere, but the earth keeps the record of the bodies. Humanity was not the only casualty of this violent planetary reset. To understand the true, devastating scale of this boundary layer, we have to look away from the ice and ask what else was living on Earth right before the cold struck. The ice cores record the sudden drop in temperature, but the Earth itself holds the bodies. At the exact same chronological boundary, 12,900 BC. A different kind of record was written into the soil. It is known as the North American megafauna extinction layer. For decades, the standard assumption was that Ice Age animals died out slowly, fading away as the climate gradually shifted and human hunting took its toll. But the physical evidence tells a much sharper, more violent story. This was not a slow evolutionary fade. It was the sudden, catastrophic emptying of a familiar world. The giants that humanity had walked beside, hunted and painted on cave walls simply vanished in the span of a single human lifetime. The fossil records preserved in the suffocating depths of the La Brea tar pits capture this synchronized event with haunting clarity. 35 entire genera disappeared at once: mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, and dire wolves. They had survived previous glacial cycles without issue, yet they were all erased in this exact same geological instant. For the human populations living alongside them, this mass death meant their fundamental food web collapsed overnight. We often think of ancient humans as highly adaptable, slowly changing their habits over thousands of years. But when the primary source of your survival dies out in a matter of decades, there is no time to slowly figure out a new way of living. The survivors faced immediate, inescapable starvation. The landscape they knew turned hostile, forcing extreme adaptation and desperate migration across a freezing, unrecognizable world. They had to abandon their established territories and learn entirely new ways to hunt smaller, faster prey just to keep their lineages alive. The physical devastation of this older world was absolute. The ecosystems that had sustained any early human organization were wiped clean, leaving nothing but a sprawling biological graveyard beneath the frost. Everything was reset. The traditional hunting grounds, the deeply understood territories, and the inherited knowledge required to bring down the giants became useless memories almost overnight. Which forces us to look back at the stones of Göbekli Tepe with a profound sense of scale. If the human world was violently reduced to small bands of starving survivors running from an endless winter, we have to look closely at what existed right before the cold arrived. What kind of society possessed the resources, the time, and the specialized engineering knowledge to carve and raise those massive monuments just before this cataclysm erased their world? Let us return to the physical reality of the stones themselves. At the site of Göbekli Tepe, the earth is dominated by massive limestone monoliths, carved into perfectly balanced T-shapes. They stand in deliberate concentric circles, silent and impossibly heavy. To truly understand the anomaly of this place, you have to feel the physical friction of the stone. Imagine a single block of solid limestone weighing up to 16 tons. Now imagine the task of moving that weight uphill from the bedrock. You have no wooden wheels to reduce the friction. You have no draft animals to pull the sledges. The horse and the ox will not be domesticated for thousands of years. You have no iron levers and no bronze pulleys. You have only human hands, ropes woven from plant fibers, and the raw gravity of the earth fighting every single inch of your progress. This is a brutal engineering problem that requires a mechanical solution. An extensive engineering analysis by the Technical University of Berlin looked directly at this logistical nightmare. Researchers examined the ancient bedrock quarries, which sit between 100 and 500 meters away from the main temple enclosures. They found no traces of lost machinery and no hidden caches of metal tools. The limestone was cut through sheer, grinding attrition. The builders used stone-on-stone percussion and flint abrasion, scraping away at the solid bedrock for months just to free a single pillar. Then they had to lift that 16-ton mass, transport it across the uneven landscape, and stand it perfectly vertical in a shallow socket without letting it snap. A project of this staggering magnitude requires something far more complex than just raw muscle. It requires a vast, invisible human infrastructure. To extract, transport, and erect even one of these stones, you need hundreds of tightly coordinated workers acting in unison. Those workers must be fed by a dedicated supply chain of foragers working at an industrial scale. You need site managers to direct the labour. You need master stonemasons who have inherited generations of specialised guarded knowledge. In short, you need a highly stratified society, operating with clear leadership and divided classes of labour. And this is exactly where the clean, linear version of our history officially breaks. According to mainstream archaeology, this level of social complexity is strictly reserved for a much later age. We are taught that human beings only developed stratified societies, specialist classes, and monumental architecture long after the invention of agriculture. The standard textbook sequence says that farming creates a food surplus, the surplus allows for kings, and the kings build the temples. But the builders of Göbekli Tepe were simple hunter-gatherers. They lived in a world before the first seed of wheat was ever deliberately planted. The timeline is entirely backwards. The physical evidence proves that someone organised hundreds of labourers to move literal mountains of stone, entirely outside the accepted boundaries of human progress. They possessed a deep, accumulated mastery of engineering and logistics that simply should not exist in pre-agricultural bands of nomads. The developmental model of human history cannot hold the weight of these pillars. They achieved the impossible, using nothing but raw stone and human will. But the mechanical effort itself is not the deepest mystery of the site. The real question is what drove them to do it. Why did they pull 16-ton monoliths out of the bedrock, drag them up a hill, and align their massive faces perfectly to the sky? The 16-ton stones of Göbekli Tepe are an engineering impossibility, but their sheer weight is only the first layer of the problem. When we stop looking at how they were moved and start looking at where they point, the simple timeline of human history bends even further. The builders did not just place these pillars randomly in the dirt, they locked them into a deliberate grid that mirrors the sky. We expect this kind of spatial precision in the stained glass of medieval cathedrals. We expect it in the calibrated lenses of modern observatories. We understand that a society needs centuries of stability, written language and mathematical theory to track the heavens with exact geometry. We certainly do not expect it from small bands of people roaming the hills in animal skins. Yet, the stones of Enclosure D hold exactly this kind of celestial mapping. Measurements conducted by the University of Edinburgh School of Engineering reveal a highly sophisticated design. The central pillars of Enclosure D are aligned exactly 7 degrees east of north. When researchers calculated the position of the stars as they would have appeared in the night sky in the year 9600 BC, a perfect match emerged. The stones form a precise sight line tracking the heliacal rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky. The southern orientation perfectly frames the sunset on the winter solstice during that exact epoch. To align megaliths to a specific star requires more than just looking up on a clear night. The sky above us is a moving, rotating canvas. To lock a massive limestone block to a star's rising point requires decades, if not centuries, of continuous observation. It requires a memory that outlives the observer. It means these supposedly primitive people were sharing localized astronomical data across multiple generations. They were comparing notes. They were watching the slow, grinding machinery of the cosmos and predicting its movements. And this brings us to the most unsettling part of the anomaly. The Earth wobbles on its axis, a cosmic phenomenon known as axial precession. Because of this slow wobble, the positions of the stars change slightly every single year. They complete a full cycle only once every 25,772 years. To accurately align megalithic stones to Sirius while accounting for this drift requires a mathematical understanding of precession itself. According to the official story, this level of astronomical mathematics was not discovered until thousands of years later by settled agricultural empires. Hunter-gatherers possessed no farms, no wheels, and no writing. Yet somehow, they possessed the mathematical architecture of the cosmos. This is the quiet violence that Göbekli Tepe inflicts on the standard timeline. It proves that the human mind was engaged in high-level scientific observation long before the first seed of wheat was planted. The knowledge required to build this observatory simply should not exist in that era. Yet, there it is, a trace of something entirely different, carved into the bedrock and defying every textbook. They had engineered a masterpiece. They had built a physical machine out of limestone that perfectly synchronized the Earth with the stars. And then, around the year 8200 BC, the builders did something even more inexplicable. They deliberately buried the entire complex. The paradox of the advanced observatory, standing perfectly aligned with the stars, is resolved by an event that defies all conventional logic. Around 8200 BC, the builders of Göbekli Tepe did something completely inexplicable. They did not simply walk away from their masterpiece. They did not leave their monumental architecture to be slowly consumed by time, wind, and natural decay. Instead, they buried it. This was not a hasty retreat from a dying landscape. The act of concealing the site required an engineering effort almost as massive and coordinated as the original construction. Hundreds of workers had to gather, transport and pour thousands of tons of limestone rubble, flint chips, animal bones, and earth directly into the sacred enclosures. They packed the debris tightly around the 16-ton pillars, carefully sealing the carved animals and the astronomical sightlines in a literal mountain of artificial fill. They choked their own temple with dirt, working methodically to erase it from the horizon. For decades, modern historians assumed that ancient ruins were simply swallowed by the earth, covered by thousands of years of dust and neglect. But the physical evidence at this site points to a completely different reality. The excavation reports and soil analysis from the German Archaeological Institute have meticulously documented the stratigraphy of this burial. The layers of earth covering the towering pillars are not the result of gradual sediment accumulation. The debris contains distinct tool marks and organized dumping patterns, showing the undeniable signature of an intentional, highly organized backfill. The stratigraphy proves that the exact same culture that spent generations carving the stones made the deliberate, agonizing choice to wipe them from the surface of the world. This monumental effort of concealment did not happen in a vacuum. The timeline of the burial synchronizes perfectly with the final violent meltwater pulses of the Younger Dryas epoch. As the global climate shifted once again, the frozen world began to rapidly thaw. Sea levels surged, and weather patterns became violently unstable. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were astronomers. They watched the sky, they tracked the changing cycles, and they likely understood exactly what the shifting atmosphere meant. The stable environment that had allowed them to build their sanctuary was ending. Burying the temple was not an act of surrender, nor was it a primitive ritual of abandonment. It was a desperate, highly calculated act of preservation. If they had left the limestone pillars exposed to the chaotic elements, the coming floods, the migrating populations, and the millennia of rain would have eroded the incredible carvings to dust. By sealing the entire complex under thousands of tons of earth, they created an indestructible time capsule. They hid their knowledge in the dark, where the weather and the shifting world could not touch it. The burial of Göbekli Tepe reveals a profound and unsettling truth about the civilizations that came before us. Sometimes, the only way to ensure that a memory survives a cataclysm is to deliberately erase it from the present. Their knowledge was protected precisely because it was removed from human eyes. But buried stone and packed earth were not the only mediums chosen to outlast the reset. While the architects of Göbekli Tepe locked their celestial maps in hidden limestone, other fragments of humanity sought different ways to carry the memory of the world across the boundary of destruction. They needed a record that could be carried, copied, and whispered down through generations of survivors. To find what they remembered, we have to look past the buried monuments. We have to turn to the surviving clay tablets of the Sumerians, who recorded exactly what the world looked like before the great destruction swept over it. The massive limestone pillars of Göbekli Tepe survived because they were sealed beneath thousands of tons of deliberate backfill. But burying stone is not the only way a culture can leave a trace. Sometimes, the heaviest weight of history is carried by something small enough to hold in your hands. When a cataclysm shatters the physical infrastructure of a civilization, the survivors are left with only what they can carry. In the generations that follow a global reset, memory becomes the most fragile and valuable resource on Earth. Spoken traditions stretch across the centuries trying to hold on to the shape of the vanished world, but eventually those spoken memories must be anchored to something physical if they are to endure the slow erosion of time. A clay tablet, baked in a fire, becomes a survival capsule. It is a vessel meticulously designed to carry the memory of an erased epoch across the dark boundary of a ruined world. There is a specific object that performs this exact function. It is known as the Weld Blundell Prism. Today, this artifact rests quietly behind glass in the collections of the Ashmolean Museum. It is a small, four-sided block of baked clay, densely covered in ancient cuneiform script. The physical artifact itself dates to the year 2170 BC. But the information carved into its surface is vastly older than the clay that holds it. This object contains what historians call the Sumerian king list. It is an exhaustive record of the rulers of Mesopotamia, tracing the lineage of human authority back to its absolute origin. If you read the long columns of cuneiform, you might expect to find the standard, linear progression of early city-states and the typical lineage of mortal kings. But the list does not offer a smooth, unbroken ascent from primitive beginnings. Instead, the text insists on a terrifying structural division. It explicitly splits the history of the world into two distinct eras. There is the post-flood world, which matches our accepted historical record. And there is the pre-flood world, a deep antiquity stretching backward into the unknown. The dividing line between these two eras is not a slow decline. It is a sudden, violent geographical event. Partway through the long list of ancient rulers, the meticulous record-keeping stops. The scribe presses a single, devastating sentence into the clay. The phrase reads simply, "Then the flood swept over." In the context of the document, this is not presented as a myth or a religious allegory. It operates as a strict historical marker. It is a hard boundary, an acknowledgement of a sudden cataclysm that erased the previous reality and forced humanity to rebuild from the mud. This small block of clay changes how we must view the ancient timeline. It proves that human memory can outlast the destruction of empires and the drowning of coastlines. The scribes who created the prism were transcribing an incredibly deep oral tradition, dragging it safely across the threshold of written language. They were preserving the reality of actual pre-flood structures, holding on to the memory of a highly organized society that existed long before the waters rose. The text calmly insists that an advanced world existed before us. But as we look closer at the names of those antediluvian rulers, a strange anomaly appears. The list carefully records the kings who governed this forgotten era, yet the numbers attached to their reigns refuse to behave like ordinary time. We leave the buried pillars of Göbekli Tepe and move forward in time, searching for a trace of what survived. We find it not in stone, but in clay. Inside the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, there is a four-sided artifact known as the Weld Blundell Prism. Inscribed in the year 2170 BC, it is known today as the Sumerian king list. It does not begin like a myth. It begins like a mundane ledger, recording the transfer of power from one ruler to the next. But then, the numbers break the boundaries of human reality. The text records a specific, impossible number. Beginning with the very first ruler, King Alulim, it states that the pre-flood kings reigned for a staggering 241,200 years. A modern human mind immediately rejects this number. Understanding the biological limits of bone and blood, we assume the ancients were simply exaggerating. We project our own habits onto them, assuming this was just political propaganda meant to make a local chieftain seem like a god. But there is another way to read the clay. If we stop treating this as a biological lifespan, a different pattern emerges. We have to translate this impossible stretch of time into the language of the sky. We must look at it as astronomical timekeeping, the mathematics of celestial cycles grinding slowly through the dark. The modern understanding of this text comes from a scholar named Thorkild Jacobsen. In 1939, he published a definitive translation of the Sumerian king list, revealing a deeply specific antediluvian section. It lists exactly 8 kings. They ruled in an unbroken chain before a massive cataclysm. According to the clay prism, these 8 individuals held power for that entire span of 241,200 years. And then, the tablet delivers a chilling dividing line. It states simply that the flood swept over the earth. For nearly a century, the standard academic response has been to quarantine these numbers in the realm of folklore. The official story suggests that early societies lacked a mathematical grasp of deep time, inventing vast numbers to make their ancestors seem grand. But when you look closely at the text, the numbers are too specific. They are too mathematically deliberate to be random boasting. They do not read like the poetry of a storyteller. They read like the surviving data of an astronomer. These figures correlate deeply with the slow wobble of the Earth, a cosmic mechanism known as axial precession. The reigns of these 8 kings are not biological ages. They are encoded celestial cycles. They represent a highly sophisticated system of astronomical timekeeping, tracked by a civilization that had enough stability to watch the stars move over tens of thousands of years. Time was measured differently before the reset. The people who built the megaliths and watched the ice melt did not measure their epochs in mere human lifetimes. When the cataclysm came and the flood swept over the earth, the context for this knowledge was violently erased. The survivors carried the numbers forward, but they forgot what the numbers meant. We are left holding the raw mathematics of a vanished world. We are reading ancient star charts as if they were simple birth certificates. But the prism does not just record abstract numbers, it also records physical geography. The list tells us exactly where kingship first descended from heaven. If the math is a surviving ghost of a lost epoch, we must ask about the land itself. Where was the physical location of this very first city, before the water swallowed it whole? According to the clay prism, before the world was erased, there was Eridu. It is named in the ancient records as the very first city. This was the exact origin point where the timeline of human civilization supposedly began. The text makes a strange, absolute claim about how this society formed. It says that kingship descended directly from heaven to this specific place. It treats complex urban life not as a slow, gradual invention of early farmers, but as a sudden, downloaded inheritance from a higher source. For centuries, mainstream historians comfortably treated this idea as pure mythology. It was assumed to be an abstract fable, a story written long after the fact simply to justify the power of later rulers. That assumption held perfectly steady, right up until the moment archaeologists started digging into a massive windswept mound of dirt in the southern desert. Between 1946 and 1949, the Iraq Department of Antiquities launched an excavation at a desolate site known as Tel Abu Shahrain. Beneath the heavy layers of dry sand, they did not find a myth. They found the physical remains of Eridu, sitting exactly where the ancient king list said it would be. The excavation revealed dense settlement layers reaching deep into the earth. They uncovered complex temple architecture dating all the way back to 5400 BC. The physical dirt perfectly validated the claims of the ancient clay tablet. What was supposed to be a purely symbolic origin story turned out to be an accurate architectural footprint. The physical world and the written memory were describing the exact same place, separated by thousands of years of silence. Because this mythological city is entirely real, the rest of the ancient tablet can no longer be dismissed as a simple fable. It forces a complete shift in how we read these surviving texts. The king list is a strict geographical record. It is a carefully guarded archive of a world that actually existed before our own. Eridu proves that the scribes who carved these impossible numbers were not inventing a scattered fantasy. They were fiercely protecting the memory of a lost era, anchoring their identity to a place that had long since vanished. We are slowly being forced to realize that ancient myth is rarely fiction. It is often just traumatized history, carrying the weight of events too large for ordinary language. This physical proof anchors the ancient list in solid earth. But it also creates a profound, unsettling problem for the official historical timeline. If the first city before the flood was a physical reality, with real streets and real temples, we have to ask a much darker question. What about the terrifying global cataclysm that the texts say wiped it from the face of the earth? Inside the quiet halls of the British Museum, there is a shattered piece of baked clay resting under glass. It is officially catalogued as fragment K.3375. To the rest of the world it is known as Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The physical object is small enough to hold in one hand, covered in the dense wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform script. But the story pressed into that clay carries the weight of a ruined world. When a wall of glacial meltwater erases a civilization, it does not leave behind a neat archaeological layer. It strips the soil from the bedrock. It drowns the coastal centres where human life gathers. And for the scattered groups that survive, it leaves behind a cultural trauma so profound that it can only be processed through the language of divine wrath. The survivors have no scientific vocabulary for a rapidly shifting climate, so they describe the sky breaking open. Tablet 11 preserves exactly that kind of trauma in the account of Utnapishtim. Long before the Book of Genesis was conceived, this Mesopotamian text recorded a devastating 7-day deluge that swallowed the earth. The narrator describes the horizon turning black. He speaks of the fierce winds tearing the posts from the ground, of the rising waters sweeping over the mountains, and of absolute silence falling after humanity was turned back into clay. For over a century, historians treated this text as an exaggerated memory of a river overflowing its banks. It was categorized as a localized myth, safely quarantined from actual history. But when you place the words of the tablet next to the Greenland ice core data, the academic boundaries begin to fail. The violence described in the clay perfectly matches the physical reality of the Younger Dryas climate collapse. Around 9,600 BC, the sudden melting of the northern ice sheets would have sent catastrophic pulses of water across the globe, drowning the lowlands exactly as the ancient text remembers. This is not a regional poem. It is the traumatized memory of a global reset. The story of the flood was carried through oral tradition across thousands of years, passed from generation to generation in the freezing dark, until someone finally inherited the writing system capable of recording it. We are taught to assume that myth is the opposite of fact. We view ancient stories as the superstitious dreams of early people, but in the context of cyclical erasure, a myth is a survival capsule. It is a highly engineered vessel designed to carry a terrifying historical event forward across deep time, simply because the event itself was too massive for ordinary records to hold. If the people of Mesopotamia were the only ones who remembered the water, we could still dismiss the tablet as an isolated tragedy. We could close the museum display and return to the safety of the standard timeline, but they were not the only ones watching the sky as the old world ended. The dialogue was recorded in Athens, but the memory belongs to the shadowed stone walls of Sais. In the text known as the Timaeus, written around 360 BC, the philosopher Plato preserves a very specific, quiet conversation. It took place centuries earlier, when the Greek lawmaker Solon travelled to the Nile Delta. He went seeking the deepest history of the world. He stood before an ancient Egyptian priest, expecting to trade mythological stories about the origins of humanity. But the two men were speaking entirely different languages of time. The Greeks lived in a world of fluid mythology, where the past was a blur of heroes and gods. The Egyptians operated a massive bureaucratic machine of institutional memory. They did not deal in vague folklore. They dealt in ledgers, king lists, and astronomical records carved deep into the temple pillars. When Solon tried to impress the priest with Greek antiquity, the priest famously laughed. He called the Greeks children. He told Solon that his people remembered only one deluge, because they had forgotten the ruins of the worlds that came before them. The priest then opened the archives. He described a highly advanced island civilization that had existed far beyond the Mediterranean. It was a maritime power of immense wealth and engineering capability, but it did not slowly decline, and it was not conquered by a rival empire. According to the priest, it was entirely erased in a single day and night of catastrophic flooding and tectonic violence. The earth shook, and the ocean simply swallowed it, leaving only unnavigable mud in its wake. And the priest gave Solon a very specific date for this cataclysm. He stated that the destruction occurred exactly 9,000 years before their conversation. Mainstream history has long treated this account as a philosophical allegory. It is dismissed as a fiction, invented by Plato to illustrate an ideal society. But the text itself aggressively resists this categorization. Plato insists repeatedly that this is a true, physical ledger. The Egyptian priest was not reciting a campfire story. He was reading from a physical archive. He pointed to the sacred registers held within the temple. These were tangible documents, protected from the elements, copied and recopied by generations of scribes working in the dim light of the sanctuaries. The Egyptians were looking backward through a deep, terrifying tunnel of recorded time. They were holding on to the literal receipts of a vanished world. This changes the nature of the Atlantis story. It removes it from the realm of fantasy and places it squarely in the context of ancient administration. The narrative represents an unbroken chain of physical archives that predated Greek civilization by millennia. While the rest of the Mediterranean was repeatedly knocked back into the Stone Age by environmental collapse, the Egyptian priesthood maintained a continuous line of transmission. They sat in their stone sanctuaries, watching the sky and writing down the disasters that wiped out everyone else. This is the quiet power of institutional memory. Oral traditions eventually fade, degrading into myth as the generations pass. But a dedicated, isolated bureaucracy can hold on to truths that the broader culture has entirely forgotten. The temple becomes a survival capsule. It preserves the exact coordinates of a lost reality, waiting for someone to finally read the record as history rather than poetry. The priest did not offer a vague era. He offered a hard mathematical anchor. Solon stood in that temple in the year 590 BC. The priest told him the Great Flood happened exactly 9,000 years prior. And when we take those numbers seriously and simply do the math, something impossible happens. The Egyptian priest speaking to Solon did not offer a vague era or a mythological age. He provided a specific mathematical metric. He stated that the cataclysm occurred exactly 9,000 years before their conversation. We know from the historical record that Solon made his journey to the temple at Say in 600 BC. The mathematics involved are completely straightforward, leaving no room for interpretation. 9,000 years added to 600 BC. That simple calculation places the destruction of this predecessor civilization at precisely 9,600 BC. For centuries, classical historians treated that massive number as a philosophical exaggeration. They assumed it was a fictional date, invented by Plato to give his story the psychological weight of deep time. It was entirely safe to dismiss it as an allegory, as long as history was only measured by looking at texts. But modern geology operates on a different scale, using physical evidence rather than literary analysis. When climatologists drove their drills deep into the Greenland ice sheet for the GISP2 project, they were looking for the exact boundary line of the Younger Dryas climate collapse. The microscopic bubbles of oxygen isotopes trapped in the core samples recorded a sudden catastrophic shift in global temperatures. The ice does not deal in myth or metaphor. It simply records the physical reality of the atmosphere, and the date firmly locked into the ice for the end of that specific violent cataclysm is exactly 9,600 BC. Sit with the sheer scale of that alignment for a moment. An Egyptian priest reading from a temple archive over 2.5 millennia ago, and a modern team of glaciologists analysing frozen isotopes in a laboratory, both point to the exact same century. This is not the shape of a random coincidence. A localized oral tradition could never accidentally guess the precise terminal date of a global geological disruption. The numbers are too specific, and the gap in time is too vast. The implication is stark, and it fundamentally changes how we must read these ancient archives. The timeline recorded in the Egyptian temple was not an allegory, it was a perfectly preserved ledger. The survivors who passed down this account were not telling campfire stories to explain the rain. They were transmitting precise, accurate geological data across millennia, treating the memory of the cataclysm as a physical fact that had to be maintained. What we have systematically dismissed as primitive mythology is actually a survival capsule of hard historical record. The absolute convergence of ancient ink and glacial ice proves that the date is exact. The memory of the erasure remained perfectly intact, carried forward by people who understood exactly what they had survived. But words written on temple walls and stories translated into Greek philosophy are not the only records that crossed that freezing boundary. If precise chronological dates survived the transition between worlds, then physical measurements of the Earth itself could also endure. To find them, we only have to look at the impossible geography preserved on ancient source maps, the charts that somehow refused to burn. Deep within the archives of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, there is a damaged piece of gazelle skin that remembers a world its creator never saw. It is the Piri Reis map, drawn in the year 1513 by a high-ranking Ottoman admiral. On the physical surface, it appears to be just another navigation chart from the Great Age of Discovery. But when you look closer at the fading ink and the precise geometry, a different reality emerges, because a map of this caliber is rarely a single isolated achievement. To understand cartography in the early 16th century, we have to look at how these documents were actually made. Map-making was not simply about sailing into the dark ocean and sketching a shoreline from the deck of a wooden ship. It was a rigorous act of compilation and preservation. A master cartographer was essentially an archivist. They would collect older, fragile sea charts, cross-reference their overlapping coastlines, correct the mathematical scales, and meticulously stitch them together onto a fresh, durable canvas. The accuracy of a new map depended entirely on the survival of the ancient fragments it was built upon. Piri Reis was a military commander, and he was rigorously honest about the intelligence he gathered. In the margins of his famous map, he left detailed handwritten annotations in Ottoman Turkish, explaining exactly where his flawless coastlines came from. He did not claim to have sailed these oceans or surveyed these distant western lands himself. Instead, he explicitly recorded that his masterpiece was a composite, drawn directly from a collection of 20 older source charts. Among these specific sources, he named documents dating back to the era of Alexander the Great. He also referenced charts much older than that, salvage from the deep, uncharted past, carrying mathematics that his own century had not yet perfected. This simple admission shifts the entire historical anchor. The real mystery locked inside the Topkapi Palace is not the brilliant Ottoman admiral who held the pen in the year 1513. The true anomaly is the missing archive he was copying from. Piri Reis was looking at a library of source material that has since turned to dust, a collection of physical measurements that no longer exist anywhere in our official timeline. When we look at the gazelle skin today, we are not looking at a miracle of Renaissance exploration. We are looking at a surviving physical shadow of a much older, completely lost maritime tradition. The map is a perfect mirror, reflecting a global surveying project that happened thousands of years before the first European ships crossed the Atlantic. This fundamentally changes how we must view the story of human progress. Technological knowledge does not always move forward in a straight, unbroken line of discovery. Sometimes human capability peaks, shatters, and is forced to start over. In those moments, a civilization is not discovering new truths about the Earth, but desperately inheriting them from a forgotten predecessor. The Piri Reis map acts as undeniable proof of a transmission chain, a fragile bridge of copied documents carrying advanced geographical measurements across the collapse of empires. But the most unsettling problem is not who originally sailed the oceans to draw those lost source charts. The real problem is what those missing cartographers actually measured, because the Ottoman admiral carefully copied a coastline onto his map that no human eye should have ever been able to see. The Piri Reis map was drawn on gazelle skin parchment in the year 1513. If you trace your finger down to the bottom edge of the surviving fragment, you will find something that breaks the boundaries of recorded history. There is a continuous, deeply detailed southern coastline drawn in faded ink. It shows bays, inlets, and islands extending south from the Atlantic. But this landmass is not a guess. It is a precise cartographic record of a place that no 16th century sailor could have ever seen. It is the northern coast of Antarctica. Looking at this map is not like looking at a standard historical artifact. It is like holding a medical X-ray of the Earth's deep past. When a doctor looks at an X-ray, they are seeing the hidden bone structure beneath the skin. When you look at the lower half of the Piri Reis map, you are seeing the hidden bedrock of a continent, long before the planet froze over. You are looking at the bare bones of a drowned world, drawn by someone who stood on its shores when the water was still liquid. For decades, historians dismissed these southern contours as a simple mistake. Then, in 1966, a researcher named Charles Hapgood published a radical analysis. He did not just look at the ink on the surface of the parchment. He compared the drawn coastlines to modern seismic surveys conducted by international geological teams. These modern surveys used advanced sonar to map the solid ground beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. Hapgood discovered a mathematical alignment that defied coincidence. The 16th century map perfectly matched the subglacial topography of Queen Maud Land, showing the exact locations of peninsulas and mountain ranges that are now completely buried. This is a profound physical contradiction. Today, that exact coastline is locked beneath 2 miles of solid ice. It has been crushed under that frozen weight for millennia. No ship has navigated those bays since the end of the last glacial maximum. No human eye could have seen the shape of those coastal mountains without the aid of modern ground-penetrating radar. Yet, there it is, carefully inked onto a medieval document. The implication is as quiet as it is devastating. Someone had to sail those waters. Someone had to drop anchors in those bays, take precise astronomical measurements, and chart that coastline before the ice sheets ever formed. The Ottoman admiral who drew the map in 1513 did not survey this land himself. His own handwritten notes confess that he compiled his work from 20 older source charts, some dating back to the era of Alexander the Great, and others much older. Piri Reis was merely copying a copy of a copy, preserving a fragile trace of a lost surveying tradition. This single piece of gazelle skin changes everything we understand about the human timeline. It acts as physical proof that a highly organized maritime civilization mapped the globe in deep antiquity. They possessed an understanding of longitude and spherical geometry thousands of years before our history books say such things were invented. They sailed a world that looked entirely different from ours, and they left a mathematical record of their presence on the shores of a green Antarctica. But this map is only a surviving fragment. It points backward to a massive missing infrastructure of knowledge. If these ancient sea kings mapped the ice-free world, they must have had workshops, observatories, and vast libraries of navigational data. Where did those original source maps go? And why is the chain of transmission so incredibly fragile, leaving us with nothing but a single copied chart to prove they were ever here at all? The Piri Reis map of 1513 is a beautiful object, but the true mystery is not the ink resting on the gazelle skin. The true mystery is the profound silence of what is missing. In his own careful handwriting, the Ottoman admiral admitted that he did not survey these impossible coastlines himself. He explicitly stated that his work was a compilation, drawn from 20 ancient source maps, and today, every single one of those 20 maps is gone. They have vanished completely from the historical record. To understand how an entire epoch of human history can simply disappear, you only need to look at the materials we use to record it. Paper, papyrus, and parchment are desperately fragile things. They're biological materials, and the earth always reclaims them. They rot in damp coastal air. They become food for beetles and mould. They curl and turn to ash at the slightest touch of a localized fire. A single neglected roof leak in a forgotten archive can quietly erase 10 generations of recorded measurement. This is the brutal, unforgiving reality of the transmission chain. For ancient geographical knowledge to reach the 16th century, it had to outlive the people who measured it. It had to be copied by hand, over and over, across thousands of years. The original surveying data had to survive the collapse of the civilization that gathered it. It had to survive the deliberate burning of libraries, the violent sacking of cities, and the long, quiet centuries of institutional apathy. Most human knowledge simply does not make it through the gauntlet of time. What we are looking at in the Topkapi Palace archive is not the original blueprint of the ancient world. It is a desperate, fading echo. It is a copy of a copy of a copy, passed down through forgotten hands and dead languages. The 20 source charts that Piri Reis unrolled on his desk were almost certainly copies themselves. They were likely salvaged from the crumbling ruins of much older, unremembered empires. When you trace that fragile lineage backward, the official timeline bends into something deeply unsettling. The knowledge of an ice-free coastline had to outrun forgetting for millennia. It had to cross the dark, undocumented gaps between failing societies. The map we possess today only exists because of a narrow escape. It survived because someone, in the very last moment before the older source material crumbled into absolute dust, decided to trace the lines one more time. This is why the accepted version of history feels so clean, and why the truth is so heavily fragmented. The anomalies that challenge our understanding of the past are not the complete picture of a lost world. They are simply the tiny, microscopic fraction of evidence that got lucky. The vast majority of the human story did not survive the fire, the flood, or the slow, indifferent decay of time. Paper is a terrible vessel for deep time. It was never meant to cross the boundary of a cosmic reset. If a forgotten civilization truly wanted to leave a permanent trace, they would not write it on parchment. They would carve it directly into the bedrock of the earth. They would build something so massive that no fire could burn it, and no flood could ever wash it away. To find that kind of memory, we must leave the paper archives behind. We have to look at the deep vertical scars of water erosion, carved onto the oldest stone in Egypt. If you stand in the trench surrounding the Great Sphinx of Giza, you're looking at a physical contradiction. The focus is usually on the carved human face staring toward the east, but the real evidence is carved into the walls of the pit itself. When the original builders created the Sphinx, they did not build it up from the ground. They dug down into the bedrock, isolating a massive core of limestone. This left a sheer perimeter wall of solid rock enclosing the monument. Cut deep into these ancient walls are undulating vertical fissures. They are massive scalloped channels, some of them several feet deep, gouged directly into the living rock. To understand what these scars mean, you have to understand how the desert destroys stone. When wind blows across an arid plateau, it carries coarse sand. That wind-driven sand acts like a horizontal rasp. It scours the rock face layer by layer, wearing the stone away parallel to the ground. But water behaves entirely differently. When heavy sustained rain falls on a flat plateau, it gathers into sheets. It spills over the edges of a carved trench, rushing downward with immense hydraulic force. As it falls, it cuts into the limestone, carving deep, rounded vertical channels. The walls of the Sphinx enclosure are entirely dominated by these vertical rain channels. In 1991, a geologist named Robert Schoch from Boston University travelled to Egypt to examine these walls. He approached the site strictly as a geologist, reading the physical mechanics of the earth. His analysis was straightforward and quietly devastating. Schoch documented that the specific morphology of the erosion on the Sphinx enclosure walls could only have been caused by one mechanism. It was not wind, it was not sand, it was not seasonal flooding. It was centuries of sustained, relentless, heavy precipitation. The stone was chewed apart by rain falling from the sky. This geological diagnosis creates a profound problem for the accepted historical narrative. The official consensus states that the Sphinx was carved by the pharaoh Khafre around 2500 BC. According to the standard timeline, the monument is roughly 4,500 years old. But the physical reality of the Giza Plateau refuses to align with that date. By 2500 BC, the region had already become the hyper-arid desert we recognize today. For the past 4,500 years, Giza has experienced minimal, sporadic rainfall. There has simply not been enough precipitation to carve massive fissures into solid limestone. The weather required to cause this specific water damage did not exist when the Sphinx was supposedly built. This is where a weak trail becomes an undeniable physical anchor. We are no longer relying on copied maps or fragile manuscripts. We are looking at the mechanical physics of water and stone. In this conflict, geology overrides Egyptology. The limestone remembers a climate that the official history says never touched the finished monument. It wears the scars of a forgotten world. If the official date is wrong, and the stone was carved when the sky was pouring rain, the next step is not a matter of historical debate. We have to ask exactly when the last time Egypt actually had enough rain to carve those channels. The deep vertical fissures on the Sphinx point toward a very specific forgotten climate. Geologists know this era as the African humid period. Today, the Sahara is an endless, silent ocean of sand. But the sediment cores pulled from beneath the desert floor tell a completely different story. They hold the microscopic remains of deep freshwater lakes, vast river systems, and sweeping grasslands. If you stood on the Giza Plateau thousands of years ago, you would not see a hyper-arid wasteland. You would be looking out over a lush, rain-soaked savanna. You would hear the sound of heavy monsoon storms battering the limestone bedrock. Modern paleoclimate data confirms exactly when this lost environment thrived. According to global climate reconstructions, this window of heavy, sustained terrestrial rainfall opened around 9000 BC. The monsoon patterns held steady across North Africa for 4 millennia. The earth was green, and the water was abundant. Then, around 5000 BC, the climate abruptly shifted. The rain stopped, the lakes evaporated into salt pans, the sand dunes advanced, and the desert swallowed the vibrant world whole. This timeline is not just a footnote of ancient weather, it is a physical lock on the age of the Sphinx. The massive walls of the enclosure were cut by centuries of driving, torrential rain. But that volume of water has not fallen from the Egyptian sky since the African humid period collapsed. The geology demands a simple, undeniable truth. The monument was carved and heavily weathered, while the storm still raged. This physical reality forces a profound shift in how we view the pharaohs. When the first dynastic kings arrived to build their civilization around 3100 BC, the surrounding landscape had already been a dead desert for 2000 years. The 4th dynasty pharaoh Khafra did not commission the Sphinx. He found it. His civilization inherited a battered, deeply eroded masterpiece protruding from the sand. They claimed an ancient site left behind by a culture that had long since vanished. The monumental landscape that actually sustained the original builders is gone. The rivers dried up, the soil turned to dust, and the organic infrastructure of their society was erased by the expanding Sahara. The Sphinx is not the center of a barren necropolis. It is an orphaned survivor. It is a stone witness to a drowned green world, sitting silently in the ruins of a collapsed ecosystem. Mainstream history assumes the dynastic Egyptians took credit for creating everything on the plateau, but the pharaohs never actually claimed they were the first. If we look past the tombs and read the inscriptions carved into their most sacred temple walls, a different memory emerges. What did the Egyptians' own archives record about the primordial era and the civilization that built the world before the first time? The deep vertical fissures on the Sphinx point to a time when the Sahara was green. But we do not have to rely only on the silent stone. The Egyptians themselves left a written record of this erased epoch. Cut into the walls of the Edfu temple is an archive of a world that existed long before the first pharaoh took the throne. They called it Zep Tepi, the first time. It is easy to look at the pyramids and the golden masks of the dynasties and assume they represent the very beginning of civilization. We look back at the pharaohs as the ultimate ancient history. But the pharaohs did not see themselves as the beginning. When an Egyptian priest walked through his temple complex, he was looking back at Zep Tepi in the exact same way we look back at him. To the dynastic Egyptians, their own civilization was already late to the story. They were the survivors, living in the shadow of something much older. The ancient inscriptions at Edfu describe a primordial epoch in vivid detail. They speak of a time when gods ruled the earth directly, setting up sacred domains and establishing the foundation of all advanced knowledge. According to these texts, this original world was ultimately destroyed. A great darkness fell, the waters rose, and the divine rulers were forced to flee, leaving only fragments of their profound wisdom behind. For over a century, mainstream archaeology has read the Edfu building texts as pure religious mythology. It is comfortable to dismiss stories of an ancient drowned world as the psychological coping mechanism of early agricultural people, but the geological context changes the weight of these words. When you stand the myth next to the water erosion on the Giza Plateau, the narrative stops reading like a fairy tale. The stone proves that a sophisticated culture existed in the Nile Valley when it was still a savanna, thousands of years before the first official dynasty. This forces a fundamental shift in how we read the temple walls. These inscriptions are not religious allegory, they are traumatized history. They represent a carefully preserved oral tradition, passed down through generations of initiates, recording the memory of a pre-dynastic civilization that was erased by a cataclysm. The gods of Zep Tepi were not phantoms. They were the flesh and blood builders of the original monuments, the people who charted the stars and carved the bedrock before the climate violently collapsed. This realization changes the entire timeline of human development. It means that dynastic Egypt was not an origin story. It was an inheritance story. The pharaohs did not invent the civilization we attribute to them out of empty sand. They inherited the ruins of a forgotten world, and they spent the next 3,000 years trying to replicate a golden age they had only heard about in surviving fragments. The Edfu texts do not definitively identify who those original builders were, but they prove without a doubt that the dynastic Egyptians knew they were not the first. We are left looking at a pattern that refuses to stay buried. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately hidden. The Sumerian kings counted impossible years before the flood, and the Egyptian priests carved the memory of a destroyed golden age into the stone. These traces all point backward to the same geological reset at the end of the Ice Age. But if the destruction of the Younger Dryas was simply one turn of a much larger wheel, a terrifying question remains. How far back does this cycle of erasure actually go? The timeline of erasure extends far deeper than the melting ice. Long before the Younger Dryas froze the world, the Earth tore itself open. In the year 74,000 BC, the Toba supervolcano erupted in what is now Indonesia. It was not just a natural disaster, it was a near-extinction event. Imagine the entire global population of human beings, across every continent, every valley and every coastline, collapsing in unison. The numbers fell until only a few thousand individuals remained. The human species was reduced to the population of a single, isolated, modern small town. Every person alive today is descended from that tiny, traumatized fraction of survivors. This is not a mythological speculation. The Geological Society has mapped a massive layer of volcanic ash dating to exactly 74,000 BC. This deadly blanket covers millions of square miles across Asia and Africa. Beneath that ash, the physical record suddenly goes quiet, and inside our own bodies, the evidence is even more absolute. The Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology has identified a severe genetic bottleneck corresponding to that exact same geological period. Our DNA confirms that the global population crashed to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 human beings. We were almost completely removed from the Earth. Those few thousand individuals managed to keep the biological lineage alive. But while the biology survived, the infrastructure of their minds did not. A population reduced to starvation and perpetual winter cannot maintain specialized knowledge. Whatever oral traditions they held, whatever methods of craft they possessed, and whatever social systems they had built were buried under meters of grey ash. The biological hardware of the human body made it through the bottleneck, but the accumulated software of their culture was permanently deleted. This mechanism changes how we must view the deep past. If the human species is hundreds of thousands of years old, and we know that near-extinction events have already occurred, the timeline of human progress cannot possibly be a straight line. Any advanced societies or early technological experiments that might have existed before the Toba eruption would have been completely wiped out. Their monuments would have been crushed. Their coastal settlements would have been swallowed. Their memory would be erased. They left no trace in the physical record, leaving only a fading genetic shadow in the blood of the few people who walked out of the ash. The erasure at Göbekli Tepe and the sudden catastrophe of the Younger Dryas were not unique anomalies. They are simply the most recent scars we can read. The reset mechanism operates on a deep, indifferent geological timescale. Earth possesses a cycle of destruction that routinely clears the board. But the trigger for these repeating events may not always come from beneath the crust. If the pattern is truly cyclical, it requires a clock. To find the mechanism that dictates when the next reset will occur, we have to look away from the buried stones and the frozen ice cores. We have to look up toward the ancient and terrifyingly precise movements of the stars. The destruction of the past is not a series of random accidents. Beneath the sudden layers of volcanic ash and the rapid drowning of coastlines, a deeper mathematical order is operating. It is a slow, quiet mechanism that governs the sky above us. For millennia, ancient cultures spoke of a great year, a vast cycle of time spanning 26,000 years. To modern ears, this sounds like mythology, a poetic metaphor for the endless repetition of human struggle. But the Great Year is not a myth. It is a physical, measurable reality. To understand what the ancient world was watching, you have to picture the Earth, not just as a sphere orbiting the Sun, but as a spinning top. When a top begins to lose its momentum, its axis does not point straight up. It tilts, and that tilt slowly traces a wide, invisible circle in the air. The Earth does the exact same thing. As our planet spins, its axis wobbles. Over thousands of years, this slow, sweeping motion changes which stars sit directly above the North Pole. It shifts the entire background of the constellations, altering our orientation to the galaxy itself. Today, this phenomenon is a settled matter of astrophysics. The International Astronomical Union has precisely measured this axial precession. They have confirmed that it takes exactly 25,772 years for the Earth to complete one full wobble. Our modern instruments track this drift down to the fraction of a degree. We record it as a quirk of celestial mechanics, a data point for satellites and deep space telescopes. But for the civilizations that came before us, this 25,772-year cycle was not a matter of passive academic interest. We look at the slow shifting of the constellations and see only a distant, silent rotation. We treat the sky as a static painting, completely disconnected from the Earth beneath our feet. But a shifting axis means a shifting climate. Over the span of the great year, the changing tilt alters how sunlight strikes the glaciers. It dictates the rhythm of the ice ages, the shifting of the monsoon rains, and the expansion of the deserts. What happens in the heavens forces a physical response in the oceans and the tectonic plates. The ancient world understood this connection perfectly. Their obsession with the sky was not born from simple curiosity. Mainstream history tells us that early societies built monumental observatories merely to track the agricultural seasons or to please their gods. But you do not need 16-ton limestone pillars to know when to plant wheat. You do not need the sophisticated geometry of Göbekli Tepe to track a simple solar year. The ancient astronomers were tracking something much larger and much more dangerous. They were watching the precession of the equinoxes because they knew that the shifting of the stars was tied to the terrestrial reset. They were reading a survival clock. When you realize what they were actually measuring, the scattered ruins of the ancient world suddenly lock together into a terrifying, coherent pattern. The massive stone circles, the sight lines cut through solid bedrock, the myths of a returning cataclysm. These are not the primitive superstitions of a young species. They are the deliberate, sophisticated warning systems of an inherited science. They are the physical evidence of a civilization that had already survived one turn of the wheel, desperately trying to leave a record for the next. The monuments were built to tell us exactly where we stand in the cycle. To leave a message that survives a flood, you cannot write it on paper. You must anchor it to the one thing the water cannot wash away. You must tie your calendar to the brightest objects in the darkness, and for that, the oldest surviving architects turned their eyes toward a very specific star. The cosmic pattern of the great year was not simply an abstract philosophy. For the ancient Egyptians, it was a precise, actionable machine. They built their entire civilization around the movement of a single star and its delicate alignment with the Earth. That star is Sirius. If you look at the astronomical ceiling text carved into the oldest Egyptian temples, you do not just see gods and myths. You see the blueprints of a massive multi-generational clock. The Egyptians tracked what is known as the Sothic cycle. It is an intricate mathematical calendar that takes 1,461 years to complete a single rotation. Try to imagine the sheer burden of that observation. It is like winding a colossal mechanical clock across dozens of generations, where a single dropped gear means starting over. It requires a priest to record a star's position, pass the physical ledger to an apprentice, and trust that the chain of memory will remain entirely unbroken for 15 centuries. The physical mechanics of this clock are perfect. Every year, Sirius disappears completely from the night sky. For exactly 70 days, it is swallowed by the horizon, completely erased from the heavens. Then, on one specific morning, it reappears in the east just moments before the sun rises. This is called a heliacal rising, and on the exact day that the star returns to the sky, the waters of the Nile River begin to swell. The sky and the earth were perfectly synchronized. The return of the star was the physical trigger for the flood that brought life to the desert. Standard history asks us to believe that this was discovered by a primitive society, a people just waking up from the darkness of the Stone Age. It asks us to accept that early farmers, struggling to survive, somehow mapped an astronomical engine that takes 14 centuries to cycle. But a pattern of that magnitude cannot be mapped overnight. It cannot be figured out through simple trial and error by a newly settled society. To recognize a 1,461-year cycle requires centuries of unbroken, highly stable data collection. The precision is simply too sharp. The celestial and earthly rhythms were already perfectly synchronized at the very dawn of Egyptian civilization. The timeline strongly suggests that they did not invent this calendar. They inherited it. They were handed this mathematical perfection by a predecessor civilization. They received it from a culture that had already existed long enough to watch the great cosmic clock turn full circle, a culture that already understood how the movements of the sky drove the cataclysms on Earth. When you look at it this way, the ancient calendar is not just a tool to count days or schedule a harvest. It is a survival mechanism. It is an alarm clock passed down from a drowned world. It was a physical warning system designed to keep the survivors aligned with the dangerous cyclical rhythms of the cosmos. It was meant to ensure that the next time the sky shifted, humanity would be watching. But the evidence of these violent cosmic cycles is not only written in the stars, and it is not only carved into the heavy limestone of empty temples. The most undeniable trace of the ancient resets is hidden somewhere much smaller and much closer to home. To find it, we have to look away from the vastness of the sky. We have to look down at the microscopic biological scars left inside our own bodies. We have spent our time looking for physical traces in the deep ice, in the fired clay, and in the silent alignments of heavy stones. But there is another kind of archive. It is a ledger that does not require a temple to protect it, and it does not need a priesthood to remember it. This archive is the presence of Denisovan DNA in modern human populations. Think of this genetic code as a biological ghost. It is a living memory of a lost cousin species carried quietly inside our own bloodstream. Long after their physical world was dismantled by the cycles of the earth, a fragment of their existence found a way to continue. They slipped a message into the only medium that could survive the Great Year. In the year 2010, researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology confirmed something that shattered the accepted timeline. By analysing a single tiny fingerbone fragment found in a Siberian cave, they discovered an entirely unknown branch of the human family tree. But the true revelation was not just that the Denisovans existed, it was that between 4 and 6% of the DNA in modern Melanesian and Aboriginal populations comes directly from this vanished species. The Denisovans were here. They walked the earth, they lived alongside our ancestors, and then they were swept away. Here, the scale of our investigation must fundamentally shift. We need to step away from the massive 16-ton limestone pillars of Göbekli Tepe. We must look past the sudden violence of the Younger Dryas climate collapse. We must lower our gaze from the cosmic clockwork of the stars and look instead at the quiet, intimate reality of human biology. The truth of our past is not just buried under desert sand or frozen in Greenland glaciers. It is walking around with us, breathing, and alive. The official story tells us of a clean, unbroken line of human progress, rising smoothly and inevitably from primitive origins to the present day. But our own biology rejects that simple narrative. We did not evolve in a straight solitary line. We are a mosaic. We are a patchwork of survivors. We are a composite of lineages that endured unimaginable cataclysms, carrying the genetic echoes of worlds that were entirely wiped away. This realization carries a deep, quiet weight. It proves that a human branch, and perhaps an entire way of the life, can be erased so thoroughly that the earth simply forgets them. Their architecture can fall. Their language can be silenced. Their knowledge can vanish completely from the archaeological record. Sometimes, the only remaining monument a lost people leaves behind is a microscopic sequence of DNA, passed down through the dark generations. But if entire branches of humanity could disappear so silently, leaving nothing but genetic shadows, we have to ask where they were living when the end came. We spend our time looking for their missing workshops and forgotten cities in the dry valleys and inland plains. But the generations that watched the ancient world collapse did not build their greatest societies in the high deserts. They lived on the edges of the continents, looking out at the water, down on coastlines that we can no longer reach. The ice of the last glacial maximum did not just melt, it consumed the map. Since the peak of the Ice Age 20,000 years ago, global sea levels have risen by more than 400 feet. The coastlines of the ancient world were entirely erased. To understand exactly what is missing from our archaeological record, you have to look at the modern world. Imagine the streets of New York, the bridges of London, and the harbours of Tokyo. Now imagine all of them submerged beneath 40 stories of heavy dark water. Modern human civilization clings to the edges of the continents. Ancient humanity did exactly the same thing. The paleoclimate reconstructions from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the agency known as NOAA, show a radically different Earth. The continental shelves were not always covered by the ocean. They were vast, fertile plains. For 200,000 years, these sprawling coastal zones were the richest habitats on the planet. They offered infinite food from the sea, temperate climates, and natural maritime trade routes. This is where human beings actually gathered, built, and thrived. This creates a tragic irony in how we search for our origins. We spend our time excavating dry, inland deserts. We dig through the dust of high-altitude caves and isolated river valleys. We find scattered bone tools and broken pottery, and we assume we are looking at the great centres of the ancient world. But we are only looking at the backwaters. We are studying the isolated frontier outposts. We are looking at the places that were simply too high and too harsh to be swallowed by the rising tides. The true centres of the previous civilizations are not mythical. They are not hiding in some forgotten text or alternate dimension. They are simply buried under 120 metres of salt water. They lie in the crushing cold, covered by millennia of ocean silt, forever beyond the reach of our diving gear and our sonar. This offers a deeply grounded physical reason for the lack of obvious ruined cities. We do not need to invoke magic to explain why the predecessors left so few traces. The ocean is the most efficient eraser on Earth. It strips away topsoil. It dissolves limestone structures. It scatters timber and crushes carved stone under millions of tons of pressure. It turns the greatest early works of human hands back into featureless sand. The shoreline worlds were methodically drowned. But the rising water was only one half of the cataclysm. The survivors who fled inland did not just lose their ancestral homes. They walked into a climate collapse that would test the absolute limits of human biology. The question is not just how high the water rose. The question is how long the freezing dark lasted, and what happens to human memory when the cold simply refuses to end. We are conditioned to think of climate disasters as sudden events, a flood, a storm, a terrible winter that eventually gives way to spring. But the erasure of a civilization does not always happen in a single day. The Younger Dryas cold snap did not just strike and retreat. It settled over the earth, and it stayed. The freezing dark lasted for exactly 1,200 years. To understand the weight of that number, we have to translate it into human terms. 1,200 years is not a chapter in a history book. It is a vast, uncrossable ocean of time. It is a longer span than the entire period from the fall of the Roman Empire to the world we live in today. For 40 consecutive generations, human beings were born into a landscape of ice. They lived their entire lives under a pale, distant sun, and they died without ever knowing that the earth was once warm and green. This was not a temporary hardship. It was a permanent, freezing reality. The GISP2 ice core chronology, pulled from the deep glaciers of Greenland, proves that this was not a brief environmental anomaly. The oxygen isotope layers show a sudden plunge into glacial conditions that locked the northern hemisphere in a 1,000-year night. The coastlines drowned under freezing tides, the animal herds starved, and the agricultural windows that could have supported a complex society slammed completely shut. The infrastructure of whatever existed before was crushed beneath the advancing ice or swallowed by the rising seas. Consider what happens to human memory in a timeline exactly like that. When survival becomes the only daily goal, preserving the mathematics of the stars or the engineering of megaliths becomes a dangerous luxury. A grandfather might tell his grandson about the great stone temples or the ships that mapped the ancient coastlines. But by the 5th generation in the dark, those stories begin to warp. By the 20th generation, they become religious myths. By the 40th generation, the people who built the world before the ice are no longer remembered as human ancestors at all. They are remembered as gods, or as giants who angered the heavens. When we look at the people who emerge from this long freeze, we see small bands of hunter-gatherers using simple flint tools. For centuries, the official story assumed this meant they were primitive. We assumed they simply had not yet figured out how to build a civilization. But the survivors did not revert to stone tools out of ignorance. They reverted out of absolute necessity. When the supply chains of an advanced society collapse, when the workshops are buried and the coastal hubs are drowned, you do not build machines. You chip stone because stone is the only thing the ice cannot destroy. This changes everything about how we view the timeline of human progress. The era we confidently label the Stone Age was not the childhood of humanity. It was an aftermath. It was the post-apocalyptic shadow of a cycle that had already peaked and had already been erased. The primitive camps we excavate were not the first clumsy attempts at culture. They were the desperate refugee settlements of a broken world. For decades, these fragments of the past were treated as isolated mysteries. A submerged shoreline here, a 1200-year freeze there, the sudden appearance of ghost DNA in our bloodline, or a prehistoric map showing lands that should be fundamentally unknown. But when you lay the evidence out on a single table, the isolation vanishes. When you place the ice cores next to the megaliths and cross-reference them with the ancient myths, the threads of ice, stone, genetic memory and clay tablets begin to weave together. They form a single, undeniable pattern. For decades, the physical traces of a forgotten world lay scattered across the earth, treated by historians as isolated curiosities. A sunken coastline here, a water-worn monument there, an impossible map locked in an Ottoman archive, and a list of kings pressed into clay. In 1995, a researcher named Graham Hancock published a book called Fingerprints of the Gods. He did not simply list these anomalies, he performed a deep synthesis. A synthesis is a specific cognitive leap. It requires stepping back from the microscopic borders of specialized academic fields and looking at the scattered puzzle pieces until the overarching image finally locks into place. It is the realization that the anomalies are not mistakes in the historical record. They are the record itself. Consider the sheer mathematical weight of a single date, 9600 BC. According to the physical evidence recovered from the Greenland ice cores, this is the exact century the Younger Dryas climate collapse violently ended. It was the moment the coastlines of the Earth were entirely reshaped. The Heidelberg Academy of Sciences confirmed the exact same timestamp. 9600 BC is the precise era when the megalithic pillars of Göbekli Tepe were cut from bedrock and raised toward the stars. Then comes the memory of the Egyptian priesthood, preserved in Plato's Timaeus. When you calculate their timeline, 9600 BC is the exact year the island civilization of Atlantis was swallowed by a sudden catastrophic flood. The official historical narrative insists these data points must remain separated. It demands that we treat the ice core as blind geology, Göbekli Tepe as a localized hunter-gatherer anomaly, and the Greek dialogue as a philosophical fiction. But a fragmented view of the past requires ignoring the undeniable physical alignment standing right in front of us. When the exact same date emerges from the chemical layers of a frozen ice sheet, it is a geological fact. When it also emerges from the buried limestone of a Turkish hillside and the inherited texts of classical antiquity, the boundary of coincidence is crossed. It becomes a deliberate, undeniable pattern. The timeline bends, and the isolated mysteries fuse into a single mechanism of destruction. Seen through this unified framework, the cross-cultural flood traditions are transformed. The stories of survival preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Sumerian king list, and the ancient Egyptian temple walls are not primitive metaphors. They are not poetic allegories invented by early farmers to explain seasonal rain. They are the fragmented, desperate historical record of a real planetary reset. They are the traumatized memory of a highly advanced world that was systematically erased from the surface of the Earth. This realization shifts the entire ground beneath our feet. We are not the pinnacle of a slow, unbroken climb from the Stone Age. We are the survivors of a mechanism that operated long before human history began to be recorded. If this cataclysmic reset is a repeating cosmic cycle, driven by the turning of the Great Year, the ultimate mystery is no longer just about the dead. The question is what this inescapable pattern means for the seventh civilization, the one we are building right now. In 1949, the historian Mircea Eliade published a comparative study called The Myth of the Eternal Return. It was not a book about geology or ice cores or lost continents. It was a study of human memory. Eliade noticed something unsettling in the stories we tell ourselves about the beginning and the end of the world. We have been trained to view history as a straight, ascending line. We imagine a slow, steady march upward, from the dark caves of our ancestors toward the brightly lit cities of the present. We believe in endless, unbroken progress. But the people who actually survived the ancient world did not see a line. They saw a wheel. They understood that time is cyclical. They knew that human civilization is a fragile crop that grows, matures, and is eventually harvested by the earth. Eliade found this exact pattern recorded by unconnected cultures across the globe. The Hopi people of the American Southwest spoke of previous worlds that were wiped clean by fire and ice. The ancient Hindus calculated vast cosmic epochs where the entire universe dissolves and is painstakingly reborn. The Norse myth of Ragnarok described a winter that never ends, followed by a world rising green and washed clean from the floodwaters. These were not primitive attempts to explain the changing of the seasons. They were decentralized accounts of the exact same phenomenon. They were fragmented survival records, detailing a brutal rhythm of cosmic destruction and renewal. We look at our own era from the top of the timeline, looking safely down. We assume that our concrete cities, our steel bridges, and our digital archives are completely permanent. We assume that the ground beneath us will always remain stable. This is the natural arrogance of a culture that has only ever known the quiet temporary peace of a mild climate window. But the ice cores and the carved stones tell a much older story. They remind us that stability is an illusion. If the cataclysm clock is not just mythological, but cosmic and geological, then we are not immune. The 26,000-year cycle of the Great Year continues to slowly turn. The deep winter that erased the builders of Göbekli Tepe was not a unique or random tragedy. It was a mechanism. And if that mechanism operates on a vast unyielding schedule, then we are not the final apex of human achievement. We are simply the 7th iteration of the experiment. We are living in the quiet waiting period between resets. The past is not fully gone. Traces survived the deluge. They are hidden in the mud of the ocean floor, encoded in the microscopic DNA of our own bodies, and carved into heavy stones that were buried to protect them from the sky. The official map of history is incomplete. It is far cleaner than the real, devastated terrain. And the pattern that erased those who came before us is not broken. It is still operating right now, high above our heads and deep beneath our feet. The great wheel is slowly turning. The stars are moving back into their ancient, predetermined alignments. And as we sit among the quiet ruins of the first 6 worlds, we are left with one final echoing question. What does the pattern demand of us now?